maybe start with Yesh.
Yeah.
I guess I'm going to go with the Japanese Association and interest in the SCP Foundation. So the SCP Foundation is an internet mythos created out of the horror stories told on the internet. It began on 4chan with this particular type of story called creepypasta.
Okay.
And it's evolved quite a bit now. There's little mini movies that are being made. There's a like professional movie actually coming out for it, a few TV series, etc., etc. But for me in particular, my interest comes from the Japanese branch of the SCP Foundation.
Well, sorry, what do they
Now, the
stand for again, Yesh?
SCP stands for Secure, Contain, and Protect.
Okay.
The purpose of this is that the idea, the mythos, is that there are supernatural beings out there, or things, anomalies, or activities that are unexplainable by science right now.
Yes.
And the Foundation exists to secure them, contain them, and protect people against them, prevent panic, and if one of them accidentally destroys the Earth, to restore Earth and resolve that issue. This has happened a few times already, according to the SCP lore. In the West, it's largely used as like a horror tales kind of situation. There's been 2 horror games made out of it. In Japan, sorry, let me just go on this chronologically a little bit. I'll come back to Japan in a second. The SCP Foundation has branches, or branch websites at least, in lots of countries. Currently, it's about 20 countries have their own foundation website. But the majority of these websites have a localization of the stories told in the West, the normal ones that we get in the international SCP Foundation website, and a few, up to 6, SCPs invented for those countries. And the SCPs made for countries oftentimes relate to the culture of that country and their own ghost story.
Okay.
Meanwhile, in Japan, not only do they have 20 separate organizations associated with the SCP Foundation for Japan in particular, an organization has to have 20 members that are active at least once a year. So in other countries, we have a tendency towards having 6 to 10 people who say they will maintain the SCP website. In Japan, they have 120.
Okay.
Other countries produce around 3 to 6 SCPs for their country. Japan has produced 3,000. And
Okay.
culturally speaking, the reasoning for this is actually quite entertaining, I think. I have a theory that's not 100% confirmed, but it has been discussed and it is generally accepted, but it's not confirmed. And the reasoning is simply because in Japan, they've had an SCP Foundation style of mythos long before the SCP Foundation ever was brought together via internet stories, which was the Demon Hunters, or the what do they call them? The things that seal spirits? I forget what they're called.
Well, Shinto priests and also Buddhist priests have demon sort of suppressing duties generally as part of their rituals.
Exorcism duties.
The exorcism duties in particular. I know that Exorcist manga is something that I've read a whole bunch of. So the Japanese branch of the SCP Foundation has taken all of their stories about like, what's that toad-like creature that lives in water?
Kappa.
Kappas. Has taken like kappas and made them an SCP. Assorted other spirits. Many of their the god of the sun. What's the name? Not
Amaterasu?
Aragami. Amaterasu. Sorry. Yes. Once again, I skimmed over this, but I haven't memorized the names or anything. Amaterasu is a figure in the Japanese SCP Foundation. And so what we have ended up with is a kind of a weird, colloquial, not official retelling of Japanese lore, but like the small lore, not the religion, not the
like
spiritual
some of the yokai myths.
Exactly. So it's a bunch of yokai myths. It's a bunch of the weird happenings. They've incorporated some of the more modern happenings, like the nuclear plant breakdown, the attack on the subway, and all of that stuff.
Yes.
They've incorporated it into their spiritual telling, and
that's
they've made
so
it
Japanese.
SCPs.
One thing I
just
just comment on with Japanese people is you have your organizations like I've described, like Happy Science and Sokoda Gakkai, but none of them really believe in like God or like an afterlife or anything like that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But every Japanese person secretly believes in ghosts and yokai and that sort of thing.
So
That's like that's the real religion in Japan, and it makes
I
total
just
sense
said-
that this exists.
I just said 120 people have agreed to be admins for their boards to keep the websites well maintained and stuff. And I said that there were 3,000 SCPs, but the amount of people in Japan accessing their websites and submitting SCPs and stuff is hundreds of times that size. They have said that they review thousands of SCPs every month, and they deny all of them basically. So the fact that 3,000 have gotten through to the level of quality that they want is already kind of a suggestion that they've received more than 300,000 requests. And the reason why I'm bringing this up as my personal conspiracy theory of Japan is because nobody well, okay, I'm not going to say nobody. The majority of people don't believe that this is an actual organization that actually does this. But there is enough yeah, I could see that happening amongst the people who are involved with this, that if they saw something weird, they would think SCPs are real immediately.
Have you ever noticed in Japanese media when like a monster or something is sort of revealed, there's somewhat less disbelief than is traditionally exhibited in Western media.
Yeah. I mean, like,
I did want to just highlight this particular thing because I found the JP SCP Foundation has a manga dedicated to it. In fact, just as a note, I just think that this is one of those eccentricities that we don't see when we're talking about Japan normally. But their association with the SCP Foundation is active, incredible. It's compared to every other country, literally every other country, they have 2 magnitudes of order more stuff.
I mean, one of the direct influences of the SCP lore, if you want to call it that, is cosmic horror, right? Like H.P. Lovecraftian style cosmic horror. So it makes complete sense because Japan is in love with cosmic horror.
I'm not sure that's necessary. I think it might be the other way around here. I think just because Japan has
That
quite
cosmic
a
horror is in love with Japan. Yes, I like that.
I think we're in sync with Japan, right? Because Japan has a lot of that traditional sort of cosmic horror stuff as part of its, founding mythology. There's an awful lot of like onis eating people, and just behaving in weird ways in Japanese kind of mythology and history and so on and so forth.
I mean, they've got a rich sort of.
There's a yokai in Japan who's basically just a short guy with a really deformed head. There's the thing called tofu boys, who just offer you tofu, and it can be a good thing or a bad thing. If it's rotten tofu, it's a bad thing. If it's not nice tofu, it's a good thing. You get your Zasuke Warashi, Yasuki Warashi,
all your transforming spider ladies that live in mansions as well. No, sure, but for.
But yeah, then Japan fell in love with H.P. Lovecraft.
That's it.
Yeah. But I just think it wasn't such a huge leap as it was.
No,
with
definitely.
West.
It was very close by.
Also, because there is like a religious power vacuum in Japan, probably a lot of these people who would just normally be part of a church or something get absorbed into these organizations. There's also one called the ESP Research Center.
Oh yeah.
Sadly, I think there are none of them left. Obviously, there wasn't anything to it.
Sorry, I just had to put that in there.
Yes. Yeah, mob eventually disbanded. Yeah, that's what must have happened.
I actually don't think that's in the anime. That specific thing. I think that's only in the live series.
It could be.
Yeah.
I quite like the live series. It's not as bad as
actually.
people think it is.
Yeah. No, I enjoyed it.
Anyway, Dylan.
Sorry, just before we go on, I do want
yeah.
to bring up one of the SCPs so that we have an idea of what I'm talking about. Sorry, this is just
Don't be
maybe off topic, but SCP-571-JP. The JP ones, the Japanese ones have to have the JP at the end.
JP suffix, yeah. Nice.
The Lonely Sushi is a piece of nigiri that is the last piece of nigiri left on a sushi line. It is now served exclusively within the SCP Foundation and must never be picked up. The person who picks up the sushi will begin to cry immediately and tell a long story about why their life is disgusting till midnight.
Right.
I don't know why that exists, but I'm glad it does.
Sounds like a cultural or a social trope, rather.
It just sounds like a fun organization to be part of, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's like a big old like high school club that just kind of got out of hand somehow.
That's kind of what the SCP Foundation is to a certain extent. They've polished up the Western one a fair bit, so that each story is actually kind of interesting. But I'm sure every so often one will sneak through and be like the shoes that are always untied or something.
So I know a guy who knows a guy who heard a thing that, and this is the story. Yeah. Anyway, great
Yes,
choice,
I'm
Yash.
done.
Great choice. Dylan, what do you have?
I like it. Conspiracy theory wise, I'm going to talk about something that was specifically a conspiracy theory, probably not born in Japan, but born in the West, sort of as a view of the Japanese miracle,
Okay.
which is the
The
word
economic miracle that happened in
that's
the
it.
60s, 70s,
Yeah.
80s. Yeah.
100%. It's the word that's used to describe the economic rise to power, I suppose, of Japan during that era, and also used as a comparison for the sort of lagging growth or economic growth that Japan has had since, right? So you talk about the miracle in contrast to where Japan is now.
The continuous recession it's been in for the last 30 years.
But this was a big topic of discussion in a lot of elements of the West, and there's a book that sort of includes this one conspiracy theory regarding the miracle. It includes it just sort of as an academic inclusion. You know, it goes through a whole bunch of different reasons why Japan may have increased in economic power. This is one that it includes because some academic scholars tended to think along these lines. For anyone that's interested, the book's called Japan Since 1945, The Rise of an Economic Superpower. And so this specific conspiracy theory is called Japan Incorporated, or Japan Inc. for short. And the thing that I love about this kind of conspiracy theory is there's a lot that motivates you to think that this might be a real thing. But when you think of, and part of that is that there's a gray line between, yes, there might be conspiratorial action, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's for this reason or that reason.
Okay.
So the theory basically proposes that there are three elite groups that are in collusion together, being the bureaucratic structures in Japan.
The Japanese civil service, essentially.
Yeah, the political group, specifically being the Liberal Democratic Party.
Indeed.
And business leadership, and in particular,
Zaibatsu, yeah.
In particular, it's an amalgamation of Zaibatsu. In fact, actually, it's not. It's like the Dai Zaibatsu, because it's essentially a group called the Kaidanren.
Yes.
Which is the.
It's a successor to the Zaibatsu, because the Zaibatsu were outlawed, essentially. Yeah.
It's the Federation of Economic Organizations. And so, as part of any good conspiracy theory, we've got to have a common linking denominator. And pretty much all people in positions of power, especially at that time, all went to prestigious Tokyo universities.
Mostly just Tokyo University as well, and occasionally
Yeah.
Waseda.
That's it. And this sort of is reminiscent of a lot of other conspiracy theories, including more Eurocentric ones, where you would have these sort of societies get born and these partnerships made and associations made at the university level that kind of continue on in later life.
Yes.
And so the conspiracy theory basically says that these groups are working in collusion with one another to make Japan, or were colluding with one another to make Japan dominant in the economic sphere. And they were working together or colluding in such a way that from the bureaucratic section, you would have individuals that would leave those bureaucratic structures, and they would be known as amakudari, which just means
That means
descent from heaven or fall from grace.
Yeah.
And they would go into either the political structures or the business leadership structures, both of them. But they would still maintain connections within the bureaucracies. And so you would have a lot of sway between business, these political groups, and the bureaucratic structures to be able to enact policies that were for the benefit of those businesses that form part of the Kaidanren, and create laws that would be to their benefit as well. And one of the things that they cite is that they had laws that benefited export but did not benefit import, right?
Yes.
Which, I mean, today we just know it as sort of economic policy. That is just economic policy. But back then, Westerners really thought that this was an unfair practice. Or some Westerners thought that this was an unfair practice, and that it alluded to a greater conspiracy where Japan was these three elements of Japanese society were colluding together to try and make Japan the ultimate economic power.
There was a year, just 1 year, in the history of the world where it looked likely that Japan would overtake America as the strongest economy in the world. And I think a lot of people were kind of panicking about that.
Yeah.
In America, which in retrospective looks ridiculous from where Japan is currently.
Yeah.
But I mean, the value of Japan was about 2/3 that of America, with 1/3 of its population. Now it's about like an eighth or something equivalent to that, which is a more realistic point of view after the deflation, I guess. But the one thing that's strange, right, Dylan, is you didn't mention one of these aspects, and I don't know if it's included in your theory or not. Is that the LDP was sort of part of this, right?
Yes.
And the funny thing is, it's sort of widely kind of acknowledged that the CIA had a plot to play in the LDP's ascent to power. Because post World War II, Japan was very poor, in the sense that it had been really devastated by the conflict, and such countries are susceptible to communism, and the Communist Party of Japan was in fact the most popular one, and the one most people really wanted to vote for. And America, having a vested interest in not having that happen, twisted some arms in the direction of the LDP for a number of years. Probably. We can't say for sure, but something definitely happened.
That enters the side tributary offshoots from the theories.
You're right, yeah.
So from this perspective, this is from a Western perspective on Japan, sort of projected onto Japan. They probably wouldn't involve the CIA, but this would then morph from a Japanese perspective, or from a certain other conspiratorial perspectives nowadays that is quite popular, into the CIA being involved, and there are quite a lot of Japanese conspiracy theories that sort of paint the CIA and now more recently the deep state, the QAnon stuff,
Yeah.
as being, sort of responsible for influencing a lot of sort of negatively impactful events on Japan, including
Yes.
the current tensions
Yeah.
in that region. So,
Yeah.
that it definitely plays part. I mean, from my side, you definitely can claim that there is a lot of dodgy links between top Japanese business or big Japanese business, government, and the bureaucratic structures.
Have you heard of the recruit scandal?
No,
was
there's so many scandals though. This is what I mean.
I think it's the most
tell us.
famous one. There's a Japanese magazine. I think it was from Tokyo University, a magazine that they published, which then spun off into a recruitment advertising magazine, which it was illegal to promote university students directly out of school for some reason in Japan. So it had to be done indirectly, and it could be done via these magazines, basically. So these magazines made a lot of money just kind of, giving people the direction to go in order to get the job they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And because Recruit was so successful, they had so much extra money to do with what they wanted. And the manager didn't care that it wasn't related to the core business. So they had ski resorts, they had property businesses, they grew turnips and potatoes and flowers. They bought businesses in America and so on and so forth. And they were always a private business. A private business that was valued at like $10 billion at one point, mind you. That's a lot.
Yeah.
They then wanted to go public, and they wanted to do it in the most profitable way they could imagine, basically. But in order to do this, they needed the assurance of various government departments that they wouldn't suddenly outlaw their way of doing business. So it just so happened that the Prime Minister at the time, who was a Liberal Democratic member, as it always is, suddenly received 10,000 shares of Recruit, and his deputy got 3,000, and the person who was in charge of the education policy got another 5,000, and so on and so forth.
Now you've got skin in the game.
And at the time, there was like the equivalent of $20 million or something like that, right? Because Japan was like ludicrously wealthy at the time.
Mm-mm-mm.
And it became, I think, the group became the single most valued company in the world. And to this day, it's a very valuable company. It's now called Indeed. If you've ever looked
really?
at, a job.
I have indeed looked at Indeed.
I mean, I'm sure most people even have an account for Indeed and Recruit and the various other things that they're called. That's their core business. But during the 80s, they had a lot of weird side businesses.
Yeah.
And this took down the Japanese government at the time. Eventually, it actually led to one of the few periods in history where the LDP haven't been in charge of the country. But yeah,
So to follow one good scandal after another, and I think this is like this is the fuel that feeds the conspiracy fires in my mind with regards to these things. There's so obviously to be bold about this, a culture of what we might perceive as inappropriate dealings between these entities, right? That very often these scandals just keep occurring. So I mean, like year on year, there are scandals, multiple scandals sort of arising. And I'm going to talk about one that stemmed from 2020, roughly mid-year 2020. And this is with Toshiba, right? So at the time, the chief executive, Nobuaki Kurumatani, had a very low approval rating. It dropped from when he first entered into his office, he had an approval rating with the shareholders at 99%. At this point in time, in 2020, it dropped to 57. It was the lowest approval rating for any chief executive in Toshiba's history.
Okay.
And they were facing what the news articles describe as being an activist threat, or otherwise called as investor activism. So in other words, the shareholders wanted to probably go and raise the equivalent of a vote of no confidence and get him out.
Yes.
Now, in this, right, the largest shareholder in Toshiba was, and I believe still is, a company named, or group named Efismo.
Okay.
Efismo, which is a Singapore-based company or group, and it held a 15% stake, so a massive amount of stake in terms of Toshiba shares. In this year, I believe, at the same time, Japan issued a law that stated that groups or entities or persons outside of Japan had to request permission to be allowed from the government to be allowed to vote in an AGM of a Japanese-born company or based company. Right?
Yes.
So, Efismo handed in their application to be able to vote, and were thought to vote against Kurumatani to end his tenure. The AGM was held, and only the next day was Efismo granted permission to vote. So their permission was said to have been delayed purposefully. This is part of the scandal.
Yeah.
And this goes deeper. So this is in 2020 when this is sort of being reported, right? They also state that there were several shareholders that were quite vocally against Kurumatani, and they suddenly and very unexpectedly switched their votes to keeping him in. And they did keep him in for at least another year. And then this sort of prompted a private shareholder meeting in which they all agreed that they would hold an shareholder commissioned investigation. So in other words, the shareholders commissioned their own investigation into the handling of voting at the AGM.
Okay.
In 2021, they released their report, and it came out with a whole slew of allegations from government collusion to the fact that they were that Toshiba executives were alleged to have in meetings.
Okay. What I don't understand, Dylan, is how does this relate to your conspiracy theory?
Well, okay, so the whole point is that the links between the Kaidanren, of which Toshiba is a large member in Kaidanren, right? Your political groups.
But yeah, I mean, essentially from the framework of your argument, right, the conspiracy theory would have had to have failed somewhere in the mid-'80s, right?
No. I don't think you're quite understanding. I'm not trying to say that this is my conspiracy theory, right, Chris?
No,
I'm saying that
I understand that, yeah.
Conspiracy theory, right?
Yeah.
And I'm saying that it's very easy to make these conspiracy theories, even locally in Japan, because of the way that business is conducted, because of the scandals, right? And even to this extent, right, the slew of scandal that this is over multiple years has that implication that there is a greater way of working, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there is like a lot of backhand stuff that happens in Japan.
And that's the only point that I'm trying to make, right? And
Okay.
and that it involves multiple groups and bodies of state.
Kidoki.
Hmm.
I'm still not entirely clear what the thing is we're talking about. I think, but I will summarize it as there is something in the West that surmises that Japan is inappropriately kind of benefiting its companies.
Hmm.
All right. Do you think that's I don't want to scuttle the entire third of our conversation. Is that more like just like a thing that the West does to any country that is being successful at the time, rather than a Japan specific kind of thing?
I believe so. I mean, back in the era when that was being done, which is the late '80s. I mean, I don't know if you could do it as easily today because you would have to get around a whole bunch of.
I mean, I think it's done every day with China, though. You hear like a thing about China is manipulating its currency. China is doing this, which is underhanded, sort of thing.
Sure, but China is supposed to, and I put that in inverted commas, be running off of a different economic model, right?
Sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is essentially the equivalent of accusing Japan of being too good at capitalism.
Although one might say that China is the country equivalent of a browser extension called communism, but still running off Chromium.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure that's entirely true anymore.
Mm.
Anyway, we have strayed far off topic, but we've talked a lot about conspiracies, which is our intention. And thank you everyone for listening to this. I'm sure this is probably part 3 that you're listening to currently. Thank you, Yash. Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you.
Stuff. Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys. Ciao for now.
Bye.